Thank you very much. It's slightly frightening to be up here speaking in front of so many people talking about a subject which I feel like I don't know very much about. I'm not a cyber person, so if you bear with me. I am very happy to answer questions afterwards about football, though. I did hear references to Liverpool and Man U in the previous answer, and if there's any questions about West Ham, I can answer those. And as the introduction said, I come to Norway often. I'm a great fan of your country. I would love to live here if only your football team was marginally better. So if this is something we can work on, that would be great. What I'm talking about is this. It's a paper which I co-wrote with an American colleague of mine. We were over here in December and we presented it at the Defense Academy, and it seemed to go down very well. We worked together as a good double act. He's very large, very American, very loud, very brash. I like to stand in the shadows and tell him what to do, and he does all the shouting. So I had to try and perform on my own. But it's a paper that we've been working on for a little while, and it really comes down to this idea that most people that think about cyber and focus on cyber really concentrate on the technical aspects. And what we want to do is focus on the social layer, and this argument that you can put huge amounts of efforts into patching technological means, but the social elements have been largely ignored. So what am I going to do? No, that's the wrong slide. I'll come back to that in a moment. What we're going to do is look at three different things. Why this is problematic, the fact that the social layer has been ignored, take some examples from the United Kingdom recently, and then come up with some suggestions for what might be done to remedy some of those. And part of this comes down to definitions of what is critical national infrastructure, a hugely exciting subject towards the tail end of a conference. And in the UK, the definitions of critical national infrastructure have 13 different elements, including a specific one for communication. These have long been a concern for the British government, long been a concern for the intelligence agencies. In 1996, for instance, Northern Irish Republican terrorists targeted London's electricity supplies. And critically, any single point of failure in one of those 13 aspects is thought to have potentially disastrous consequences for the other elements. But it's where they interconnect at the social layer is something which has been really ignored and is very notable by its absence. In the United States, the Department of Defense says that cyberspace comprises these three things: the physical network, the logical network, and the social or the cyber persona layer. And in the information age, the citizenry, which is any service provider's pool of customers, really demand fast, streamlined, reliable information. They want it to come to their devices as quickly as they can, and when it goes wrong, it's not their problem, it's someone else's problem. So to meet this demand, different service providers, whether it's manufacturers, whether it's network providers, have, of course, come up with very clever ways of making this happen very, very quickly. They strive to reduce the amount of energy, focus, and inconvenience that's required for customers with their technical devices. All you need is a thumbprint on your device, a PIN code if you can't work out how to use your thumbprint, an iris scan on some devices. And for many people, that is where security starts and stops. Occasionally, you might be told like this, that there's a software update. Probably you will plug your phone in overnight and let it do its thing, and the world moves on. But herein lies the root cause of the increasing disconnect between the social layer on the one hand and the logical and the physical layers on the other, which widens as technological solutions and the promise of ever more seamless and transparent security grows. By assuming the burden of responsibility for patching security on behalf of their customers, technology firms really have divorced the citizens of their necessary participation in holistic cybersecurity. They simply rely on these companies to do everything for them. And the natural but fictitious and erroneous conclusion from all of this is that the end users actually play a very minor, passive role in cybersecurity, which is very, very problematic from the societal layer, from the societal perspective. If the connection is trustworthy, so we tend to think the content must be trustworthy too. But as the case studies, which I'll explain in a moment, demonstrate, it is this social layer which is constantly under siege and vulnerable, even when the physical layer and the logical layer are patched and working effectively. So let's take some examples. Let's look at the power of propaganda, which in the 21st century has really shown itself to be a major force in shaping narratives and driving political discussion. And one organization tends to stand out in particular, the Russian Internet Research Agency, often abbreviated to the IRA, which means something slightly different in London, of course, and in the UK. But in this context, we shall take it to mean these not very nice people. And this is a building in Olgino, in the historic heart of St. Petersburg, Russia. It's a 4-story building. It doesn't look particularly exciting, but as we now know, it housed the Russian Internet Research Agency. According to a February 2018 US Department of Defense criminal indictment, this was, and I quote, a Russian organization engaged in operations to interfere with elections and political processes. This was an army of Kremlin-backed trolls, which means something very different, of course, if you watched Lord of the Rings, but in the modern era, it means this sort of things. It was a series of influence operations using bots with real people to fake social media accounts. And the US Department of Justice charged that with an annual budget in the millions of dollars, their purpose was, and again I quote, to conduct what it called information warfare against the United States through fictitious US personas on social media platforms and other internet-based media. We know from some of these American indictments that it tripled in size over 3 years. It employed over 1,000 different people, and it organized its working patterns to match the American time zones all those miles away. And we have some sense, certainly from US perspectives, of what it did. This project focused on the US population by the Washington Post a couple of years ago, and it argued that this organization had conducted operations on a variety of different social media platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the very obvious ones which lots and lots of people used. What it also revealed was that the people at this organization in Russia had done their homework very, very diligently. They knew the sorts of issues which plagued American society and which would divide different strata of society. Things like the civilian-military divide, gun control, religion, the big issues that makes America tick. But of course, the Americans are not alone in this. I do shudder slightly to put the word Brexit on the screen and to utter it, but I'll try and limit it to 60 seconds. In Britain, too, there's been clear evidence of coordinated attacks from these Russian-based organizations. And the underlying principle in all of these, it seems to be, is to disrupt politics in one form or another. Regardless of what the political issue tends to be, the focus is consistent in attempting to sow discord and create divisions within society. And what's significant is not just the message which these are portraying, but the scale of the effort. One university in London last year found that during the 4-week period in the run-up to the Brexit vote, there were 13,000 Twitter bots sent out, which distributed somewhere in the region of 65,000 pro-Brexit tweets with a clear slant towards the Leave campaign. So can we therefore blame the Russians for the holy mess that we're in? Probably not, but there we go. This research revealed that some of the tweets were also associated with the Remain campaign. Most of them were in favor of leaving, but some of them were in favor of remaining. And one simple argument is that they were there simply to cause chaos and to create lots and lots of confusion. Particularly when, in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, lots of these Twitter accounts all of a sudden disappeared. But of course, it's important to look just beyond the numbers. Did they actually achieve anything? Did they achieve anything in the US presidential campaign? Did they achieve anything in Brexit, or simply was it very thick Britons that voted the way they did? One data point suggests actually that many Britons did not decide until very, very close to the day of the referendum what they were going to vote. Quite remarkably, I found this remarkable when I heard about it, the day after the referendum, i.e. once the vote had taken place, the 2 most Googled terms were, in Britain, what is the EU, which was second after which countries are in the EU. I say nothing about my fellow countrymen and women. And these are not solitary examples. One report from Britain's Foreign Intelligence Agency, MI6, SIS, has stated, and I quote, "Russian intelligence is tasked with carrying out information operations which go beyond promulgating the Russian perspective and includes the creation and propagation of forgeries and falsehoods." And GCHQ similarly has said, again I quote, "This type of interference is likely to continue and grow. Russia has a high risk tolerance for such behavior." But of course, these are not just limited to Russia. Equally insidious is the way in which many terrorist organizations have used propagandas using social media and other things to connect jihadists and lone wolves through digital nodes around the world. Glossy magazines like these are freely available for immediate digital download. They're accompanied with high production video clips, etc., etc. And they fly around the internet at frightening speeds, instantaneously available by anyone with a smartphone, tablet, etc., etc. Often enjoying the protection of free apps which offer encryption for all of this. And a great many authors have written about how one of the central tenets of terrorism is not the attack, but the message which it portrays. And the way in which these terrorist groups in the 21st century have used social media to present this message, to expand it and distribute it, is really quite frightening. And it sends out a message, particularly to lone wolves, that if I can carry out an attack single-handedly, then so can you. And while a lone wolf terrorist may be physically alone in his geographic location, psychologically he or she is never further away from his ideological brothers when they can get this information almost instantaneously. And it poses very significant problems. And it is a worrying trend. 2 years ago, a study in the UK showed that of all of the different terrorist cases which had emerged since 1998, there was somewhere in the region of 270. 72% of those terrorist convictions or attacks or various other things had been made by British citizens. And furthermore, 67% of the individuals had either been born or brought up in the UK. So the threat in the UK, at least, is therefore homegrown, largely homegrown, and it complicates a whole variety of issues, partly changing our mindset about whether this threat is something which comes in from overseas, but more to do with how does this information move around people who are radically minded and how do they sign up to this cause. And two examples show something of this. This example comes from March 2017, and it includes, and it comprises the attack by someone called Adrian Ajao. He'd been born in Kent in East Sussex, 2 counties to the south of London, in 1964. He'd converted to Islam in 2005, had changed his name to Khalid Masood to signify his new identity. And on the 22nd of March, or maybe the 27th of March, one of those dates, he drove his rental car into pedestrians strolling along London's Westminster Bridge, killing 4 individuals. He jumped out of the car, he ran to Westminster Palace, there's the bottom half of Big Ben nearby, where politicians, of course, have their offices, and inside the entrance to the palace, he fatally stabbed a policeman. And he has been considered to be a lone wolf, but it's logical to conclude that at least some of his interaction with virulent extremism came via his smartphone. We know, for instance, that just a few minutes before his attack, the last thing he did was to check his WhatsApp account, although we don't necessarily know, and it certainly hasn't been made public if it is known, what those messages said. We also know that he was not a subject of any current investigations by MI5, the security service. And there are 2 reasons why this might have been the case. It may have been that he did most of his plotting online with secure applications and therefore did not need to physically go near any terrorist groups or countries or individuals themselves. So he would have thrown up far fewer investigative leads than would have happened in the past. Intertwining these 2 events, the Russian attacks and attempts to cause chaos, and this one, was a series of tweets which emerged in the aftermath of those attacks. One Twitter account belonging to someone called Texas Lone Star and he can only be American with a name like that and a Stetson hat like that, who had 50,000 followers, alleged that he had been doing things for a particular person. Lone Star was a self-proclaimed proud Texan and American patriot. He was a cowboy, and he tweeted lots of very right-wing messages. And one of those messages was a tweet which had the caption, it used the photograph on the left alone, "Muslim woman pays no mind to the terror attacks, casually walks by a dying man while checking her phone." It may not be very obvious from the sort of pixelated photograph, but that's what she's doing on her phone. Another message had the same image on the left, this one you see here, and it compared them and us, trying to show the discord between the Muslim woman not caring about the person who'd been run down on the bridge and a politician who had run out of Westminster to try and save the policeman who would, of course, subsequently die. But it became clear fairly quickly that actually Texas Lone Star was not an American, probably had not been to America, probably never would go to America, but was rather an entirely fictitious creation from the Russian troll factory. And just a couple of months later, there was another terrorist attack in the UK, this time in Manchester, north of London, long way north of London. At a major concert venue in the city, the performer Ariana Grande, who I have to say I'd never heard of before then, had just finished on stage. As 20,000 fans poured out of the concert venue into the crowded entrance, and she's a performer who mainly attracts teenage fans, so most people there were teenagers, there with their parents or their friends. They were coming out of the concert trying to go meet their parents. A homemade bomb exploded in a wheeled suitcase. And the perpetrator was 22-year-old Salman Abedi. He deliberately packed his suitcase bomb with nuts and bolts designed to cause as much damage and kill as many people as he possibly could. And he deliberately detonated it at the end of the concert when it would be at its busiest. Fortunately, he only killed 22 people, but these were people who were his societal contemporaries. He had been born and brought up in Manchester. Although his parents had been Libyans, they had escaped under the Gaddafi regime. And he was as Mancunian as most of the people that he attacked. In the aftermath of this, his brother was arrested in Libya, questioned by the Libyan authorities, which discovered that, and I quote, the brother and Salman had got the ideology of ISIS from the internet and some friends in the UK. And he explained how they had both watched videos together, had both become self-radicalized thanks to the internet content which they had been watching. And here's a photograph of him. And like the Westminster Bridge attacker, Abedi had had a few previous encounters with law enforcement, but was not on the radar screen of the security service as a hardened jihadist preparing to strike. And these pair of unfortunate cases really demonstrate how, despite having very secure geographic borders, physical borders, you cannot stop the virtual dissemination of ideas. And in short, they highlight the physical effect of digital exchanges. And unlike a virus which needs proximity to transmit, this social ill can, of course, infect anyone with an internet connection. But despite the challenges which these cases highlight, several solutions are readily apparent, even if they're not always convenient. And in budget-conscious times, perhaps not in Norway with all your oil, but certainly in other countries, these involve shifts in perspective, awareness, and interdisciplinary education and cooperation. So what can be done? Well, we argue that there are three things that might offer some level of solution, but not clearly full solutions. For governments, they should think about expanding their conception of critical infrastructure to explicitly include cyberspace in any list of sectors, processes, or services without which society would cease to function. As part of this emphasis on cybersecurity, it should recognize and acknowledge the social layer in all of this. For the private sector, it involves nothing less than a cultural and industrial shift. Microsoft's old-fashioned idea of Patch Tuesday, where any things could be patched whenever a virus came up on a regular basis, worked in a technical sense, but it really has outlived its useful life where society has become much more intertwined with all of these things. The private sector should consider ways to include the user in cybersecurity, beyond simply offering a thumbprint or a restart for security updates. Aside from pushing updates, perhaps it should encourage the user to somehow pull their weight, or at least play a meaningful role. And we can see the way in which governments have tried to enact this in a number of countries. Sweden and Estonia, for instance, have brought out web pages designed to try and educate the population into what they should be doing to be more cyber aware and more secure online and various other things. For the social media companies, many have taken correct steps in identifying and deleting lots of these different accounts. And similarly, they've begun to pay much more attention to what content is on their platforms and weed out things which are extremist, illegal, fraudulent. And certainly in the UK, the government has tried to shift much of the responsibility of this to the social media companies for monitoring what is put onto their different sites. But in recent years, the inherent difficulty of curating a massive platform with billions of users has led to vulnerabilities in which the social layer was often discounted or overlooked because it was simply much too complicated, much too labor-intensive to do anything about. And that sort of mentality has to begin to change. From an individual cyber persona perspective, it's perhaps no surprising that patching the social layer is by far the most challenging task. What could a patching effort for citizens actually look like? Well, the first thing is that they must reconsider their own responsibilities and relationship with cybersecurity, taking advantage of security updates when they're available, adopting additional protocols like strong passwords, etc., and perhaps some of the things which the American lady spoke about that I didn't understand. The cyber persona patch begins with an acknowledgement that alongside governments and the private sector, consumers also have a role to play in all of this, even a civic obligation to take responsibility for how they interact virtually. Simply expecting technology companies to bear the burden of cybersecurity is not enough for all of this. The cyber persona role is perhaps, therefore, the most important in all of this. Because they run along the same networks, users must seek to understand the difference between malware and manipulation. A security update may lessen your susceptibility to the former, but there's no algorithm that can remove all of the disinformation or propaganda from the digital world. And so despite there being very great strides in artificial intelligence and machine learning, they remain broadly ineffective against dishonest analysis of underlying facts, non-sequitur conclusions, and ideological spin. It's therefore improbable that social media sites will become the sole cyber security guardians. And if you're interested in any of this, it will appear in this journal very soon with lots more American bits which I decided to remove from the talk. Thank you very much.